Samuel Flockhart, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure having you here. You had, don't tell anybody I said this, but you had by far my favorite presentation at the FS-ISAC Summit here a few weeks ago in Amsterdam.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. That's really kind.
It was awesome. And I guess today you have a PowerPoint, which is not usual for the podcast, but I mean, the visuals you have there and all the work you put into it, we have to have it. Right. So before we dive into that, tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Sam Flockhart. I am the CTI manager at Santander UK. So my primary remit is cyber threat intelligence. Kind of looking at sort of different types of hackers and bad guys and people basically attacking banks. But previous to that, I was a military intelligence operator with the British Army. So primarily, sort of my career was looking at counter-Russian influence in Eastern Europe and other parts of the world as well. So that's a little bit about me.
Was that cyber related or more like kinetic?
It was mostly
both.
Mostly kinetic. I mean, a lot of the time we were looking at sort of Russian intelligence services, FSB, GRU, groups like that, how they're trying to influence other parts of the world. So mostly sort of kinetic threats, conventional threats, and then towards the latter half of my career that started to obviously become more cyber related as the cyber threat from those groups grew as well.
Cool. Well, really looking forward to it. I guess I'll just say roll the screen on your side.
What's going on? Yeah. Yeah, so effectively I sort of gave this presentation and one of the things I kind of wanted to draw out and highlight was when you're talking about ransomware, right, which is one of the most prominent cyber threats we face. It's primarily sort of a Russian problem. In this talk, I argue that almost all of the ransomware problem is coming from either Russia or Russian nexus, right? So by that I mean Russian-speaking populations that might live in former CIS countries as well. Other things we cover off here is Russia is sort of a unique environment. So a lot of this is looking at sort of the history of Russia and why effectively it offers such a good environment for ransomware and other parts of cybercrime to flourish, and probably represents the one true example of Russia being a kleptocracy. So that's probably the most accurate definition when you're looking at the Russian political model is kleptocracy, right?
Would you mind explaining that one for me? A kleptocracy? I think of kleptoman. I'm not sure if that's an English term.
So I think effectively kleptocracy means kind of ruled by, it means ruled by criminals or thieves. So it's about, the political system is one which is, systematically corrupt, but is kind of influenced a lot by, the criminal groups that are working in. So yeah, under Putin, the Kremlin has weaponized criminal activity, in the national interest. So we talk a little bit about sort of the rise of Putin and what that meant for climate Russia. And that includes ransomware. Ransomware groups have those direct relationships with Russian intelligence services. This is something we can explore later on. I'll cover off, but it's that idea that that they do have associations and relationships between these two things. And also, I guess a personal point of mine is that, ransomware does make a very good cyber weapon and is likely to be used as a weapon in the sort of short to medium term. Obviously with the geopolitical situation as it is, our relationship with Russia is very poor. And I would argue that ransomware is one of those cards up the Russian government sleeves that it can play if it chooses to. And that as we if we continue going on the same sort of trajectory that we are in terms of our relationship with Russia, that cyber is potentially one of those domains where we will see escalation between the Western world and Russia to try and avoid a sort of World War III type scenario.
Which I guess is positive. Better than the alternative, I guess.
It's better than the alternative, which we've got a slide on that later on, so hopefully that covers that.
Yeah, cool.
But effectively, sort of one of the, a large part of this is looking at cyber groups and, I like CrowdStrike, I like the cartoon characters, so, maybe you won't be able to see this, on the podcast, but we've got some cool looking slides and CrowdStrike doing a really good job of sort of bringing some of these cyber groups to life.
You have two of them in the background, right?
Yeah, I've got it.
And your real background.
Yeah, so I've got those two of my real background, so that's Fancy Bear there, so that's a GRU group, so very, kind of relevant to what we're talking about.
Cool.
And then I think we've kind of covered this off, but just probably for context. So as I mentioned, my background was military intelligence, but primarily looking at the Russian threat. I did spend, almost more than anyone on Op Orbital, which was the British Army's support mission to Ukraine, helping sort of train the Ukrainian service, military armed forces there. I also did a little bit of intelligence work. But I guess one sort of important point is that, this belief is not a Russophobic belief, right? I'm married to a Russian. I have family in Russia. I used to visit Russia quite frequently, and my kids speak Russian. And I am very passionate about sort of Russian history and things like that. So it's not, although it would kind of vilify them, maybe rightly so in this brief, when it comes to ransomware, it isn't, it's not a Russophobic thing. It's that, my life has been orientated around this Russian threat, and that kind of comes across hopefully in the brief as well. Okay. And then again on screen, so we've got lots of different logos for all the different ransomware groups, right? So some of these are, the most, important groups that you come across looking at the cyber threat landscape. So Lockbit, Conte, Clop are sort of three of the big names on screen. These groups are kind of plaguing businesses and governments and everyone else over the last 10 years, pilfering hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars from these companies. The one thing that all of these groups have in common is they all have that sort of Russian nexus, right? So they're either the developers and the key players are really operating out of Russia, or they're operating in sort of Russian-speaking regions like Ukraine, for example. So when we talk about this as a Russian problem, Chain Analysis, which is a company which primarily sort of tracks crypto payments. So obviously, once the ransomware is deployed and victims decide they're going to pay, it's always in cryptocurrency. And Chain Analysis basically will track these kind of crypto payments. An interesting stats that they picked out in 2021 was that 75% of all the ransomware payments that they tracked went to Russia, right? So that's just Russia. It's not Ukraine. It's not Moldova. And so obviously then the other 25% is going to be largely made up of, places like that. So this is kind of driving the point home, and this map next will probably illustrate that as well. If the slide goes, that when we're talking about ransomware, it's all coming out of Russia, right? So even the underlying ecosystem which helps feed this malware, initial access malware, Emotech, TrickBot, QBot, all these other malware variants that we look at, they're all again coming out of Russia. So this map will show sort of prominent places where people have been arrested in recent years, where people are thought to reside. And you can see that it's primarily Russia, Ukraine, some in Belarus, and Moldova. Interestingly, this week, actually, they did also, the Ukrainian intelligence services and police services, law enforcement, conducted further arrests against ransomware operators in Kiev and some of the surrounding regions there. So it is, again, in the headlines, and it again reinforces that point that when we're arresting any key members of these groups, they're going to be in this type of region. So hopefully that sort of illustrates one of the main takeaways from this slide. If you want to solve the ransomware problem, you've got to solve the Russian problem.
Do you mind just hopping back one slide really quick?
Sure.
I was at BrewCon earlier this year, and I think it was Mikko Hyppinen who was talking about these groups, and he said, and I agree with him, like the logos, they're like aesthetically pleasing. They look cool, and he was comparing them to like biker gangs, right? Like a scary sort of like mantra, scary, like they have to be a scary brand, but they have to be respected as well. And they kind of live up to that based on what I've heard, obviously. Like if you do decide to pay, it is in their interest to actually help you, right? And like he was comparing like their customer satisfaction numbers. They're like a lot higher than like some of the vendors that we're, used to working with. Like I won't name any vendors, but you call them, their support, you have to answer a bunch of dumb questions for an hour, and then they actually get the real help. Like that's not how it is on their side of the fence. Like they will actually help you if you're having an issue. That's just really funny to me.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the logos are pretty cool. And the Vice Society logo in particular, with that sort of GT look was really cool. I think they've actually rebranded off of that one. So they will rebrand every couple of 2 or 3 years as well. And I kind of think of it like pirate ships in a sense. Like you've got a crew, and they're obviously pilfering, trade. And some of those crew members might jump ship from one group to the next, and that's kind of probably the way to look at it. You've got your brand, you've got your main core group, but it's not uncommon for that ship to sink and then for crew members to then join another pirate ship. So there is cases, they obviously make lots and lots of money. I think sort of some of these bigger groups make hundreds of millions a year. But there is also occasions when you do pay, and sometimes, the files don't decrypt, or we have seen occasions where someone gets hit more than once. So, it is one of those things. But you're right in that these people view themselves as kind of legitimate businesses, kind of pen testing security companies. That's the kind of way in which they view themselves. So it's a professional business model that they've got, and ultimately they're not really seeing any consequences from law enforcement on the whole. So it's scope for them to do this.
Yeah, simply because they're just out of reach for most law enforcement, correct?
Yeah, on the most part. Obviously we saw those arrests in Ukraine. I would not be surprised if there was 2 or 3 of these other groups and key players in that region that will be arrested very, very shortly. But so that might scare them, spook them. But a lot of the infrastructure, the key players are operating in Russia where we can't get them. So unless you can do a deal with the Russian government on this, I would imagine that they would, give us quite a hefty price for some of these guys.
Do you actually know any details? Because that was a really fresh news case, that the arrest in Ukraine. I know the Norwegian government was mentioning that they had participated in it. What, if you had to guess, like, who would those people be? Would they be Russian nationals living in Ukraine, or they were Ukrainians, or like?
So they are Ukrainians. So this is the thing. The British media immediately put, Russian-speaking Ukrainians. It's like, because there's this narrative, they don't want to. Anything that maybe damages the reputation of Ukraine, with everything that's going on, it's just not really in the British national interest to do that. But, don't be fooled that, up until this conflict as well, large parts of these groups were Ukrainian, probably still are. So the fact that they speak Russian or Ukrainian is probably irrelevant. Huge portions of Ukraine did speak Russian and still does so. So, my take on it would be they probably are Ukrainians that they've lifted. I think these guys were associated with, things like Hive, which is on the screen there, TrickBot, probably maybe some sort of affiliations to Fin7, or one contract to Fin7. So yeah, it is what it is. But the good news is, now that we have that relationship with Ukraine, anyone who is based in that region, is potentially then arrestable. So that creates maybe some issues for them on that side.
And do you have any, like when the war started, I had an episode about the Conti leaks. So that obviously that split the group up a little bit. I guess everybody assumed there would have been a lot less, sort of ransomware when that happened, because groups sort of just like, okay, now they're half the company's enemies with the other half, I guess. Did that actually happen?
So I guess we can maybe foot forward and maybe, or we could cover it off. I don't want to go. We can maybe cover it off all the way, but
yeah, we'll come back to it.
Yeah. But I guess like one of the questions, right, is why? So why is Russia this sort of unique environment for all this type of stuff? And you have to kind of look at the history. Probably just go back to say that in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, and for a large part of the 20th century, it was in the USSR. So, communism was obviously their political ideology. And what that meant was that a lot of the industries, the private industries, were nationalized. And so effectively under that type of system, once they belonged to everybody, which was what was happening in the USSR, they effectively actually belonged to nobody. So there's nobody really taking accountability for a lot of these things. And when that whole system collapses, because they'd been in existence for so long, there wasn't really anybody to kind of pick up the pieces that had that entrepreneurial brain that was able to then take businesses and run with it. And there was severe, economic consequences for Russians living at this point. Large parts of St. Petersburg, 1993, 1994 were starving, and it was really in this dire political sort of chaos, and really it's Yelps and a couple of other people, influential figures like Anatoly Chubais, and then picks this up, and they introduced this sort of system which is called, voucher privatization. So it's the idea that a national state industry, let's say oil or gas, is then basically given to the people in the form of vouchers. But the problem really was that most Russians didn't understand what that meant and didn't understand what that was to them. So they would quite happily sell, vouchers for bread and things that they actually really needed down. And so there's kind of two political forces that emerge in the early 1990s. One is the criminal element. So, the stats around Russian criminals at this point was unreal, and the emergence of the sort of Rory Visakonian, who come about, and effectively, it wasn't that there was complete law enforcement breakdown, but what it meant was, because the system was, everything was up for grabs. So, so things like there's a really good Netflix documentary called Odessa. I think it's Operation Odessa, which was basically the story of how the Colombian cartels were buying, things like submarines from the Russians. So the Russians were selling submarines so they could smuggle the narcotics into the United States. So when they said everything was up for grabs, they kind of meant everything was up for grabs. And you really, in order to protect your business or any of your interests, you really did have to have friends with the criminals and offer them have sort of that racketeering protection, etc. Because otherwise they would just pilfer your business. So you'd have to kind of pay them off to do that. They managed to infiltrate large parts of the police force, and so they were one of the sort of major sort of groups that emerged that had power and influence at this point. And they would have this concept called krisha, which is the Russian word for roof, or basically means like top cover. So the criminal gangs would operate, but they would pay law enforcement, police, KGB, what became the FSB at that point, and they would basically pay the police services off. That meant they wouldn't get prosecuted. So that's an important concept to understand from that and measure that point, because effectively that's what happens with ransomware groups now, where ransomware groups are able to offer, conduct the crimes as long as they have the right sort of krisha and top cover in place. The other kind of force that then emerged was the only people who really had that entrepreneurial brain with the businesses was basically the Jewish community, because the Jewish were still operating businesses and things. They always had that entrepreneurial side to them. And so you have this kind of group that emerges around the campaign of Boris Yeltsin, which is primarily sort of Jewish bankers and other sort of political influencers. And they called them like the seven bankers or semi-bankers. And they kind of really manipulated Yeltsin's political campaigns in the early 1990s to the point where, he had actually no chance of winning. But because they effectively bought up media organizations and things like that, big newspapers, TV channels, all that stuff, they were able to then put out their narrative and put out all this information and really manipulate that election in their favour. And as a result, then there was favours that then went their way when it came to, denationalising industries that these Jewish oligarchs would effectively come in and take over. So that was kind of like the two forces that rose: the oligarchs and people like Boris Berezovsky and Mikhail Khodorkovsky and people like that. And then the criminal gangs that would effectively be paid to sort of protect their businesses. So this is kind of where the symbiotic relationship between, the political machine and the criminal machine is really entwined and intertwined, and they need each other. So again, coming back to the modern day ransomware situation, cybercrime, that still exists now, and that's why they can operate that way. Does that all make sense so far?
Yeah, it was really interesting. Yeah, one thing I just want to pick up on there, the sort of, I think, called the vouchers. Uh-huh. So everybody kind of got like an equal amount. All the Russian citizens got an equal amount of vouchers. But just because people were like, what am I supposed to do with this? They were actually, trading away vouchers because they didn't really know the value of it, which was totally understandable and fair. And the more entrepreneurial minded ended up just getting all those and collecting the power. And that's kind of how it went.
Yeah, exactly. And so these guys, you can see on the screen, but when we're talking about the seven bankers, Boris Berezovsky, he's quite interesting character. He ended up been found dead, and he kind of was forced into exile, which I'll cover off in a minute. Ended up in London, apparently committed suicide, but the police investigation is very suspicious into that. Mikhail Khodorkovsky is currently in exile, but he had a company which was UK soil now, then the state basically bought that over after forcing him into exile, and that's now sort of Rosneft. Mikhail Friedman, Vinogradov, Vladimir Kaczynski, Patarin, and the last one is Alexander Smolensky. So these are the sort of people that then emerged. And then there is a kind of, once Yeltsin is in power, sort of later on in the 1990s, there's another sort of political force that emerges called Semya, which is the Russian word for family. And this was Yeltsin's kind of family. So involved his daughter, involved some other sort of high-profile figures that probably your audience would be familiar with, Roman Abramovich, Oleg Onskin. These were the kind of people that really surrounded Yeltsin and began to influence his political career and basically, started to run Russia. And they basically make the recommendation as Yeltsin's coming to the end of his political career, because Yeltsin was an alcoholic. Yeltsin was, Russians found him quite embarrassing, really, the way he behaved. He wasn't very sort of charismatic, he was going to come to the end of his political career, and they were looking for somebody that they could trust that would allow them to retain the power and influence that he had. One of those characters was a guy called Vladimir Putin. So he was obviously a former KGB agent in Germany in the early 1990s. He then works in the St. Petersburg's mail office, and he was someone who he was seen as a bit of a fixer, definitely had a relationship with organised crime, was able to sort of, because he was like deputy mayor, he was able to sanction things off and make a lot of money, allow other people to make a lot of money. And so he definitely had, relationships with Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich in those early 1990s. And so he was kind of recommended by some of these groups because he was someone who was going to get things done. He had a nice background. He was someone who had security service on side, had the relationship with organised crime, and had this relationship with these political figures. So out of nowhere, really, Russians didn't have a clue who Putin was by the time he was sort of brought into the sort of presidential circle. In 1999, it kind of comes out of nowhere, and it was very much sort of influenced by Roman Abramovich and Boris Berezovsky. The issue, though, was that shortly after Putin came into power in 2000, he very quickly turned on the oligarchs. And if the oligarchs thought that they might be able to sort of bully him into doing what they wanted, that was definitely not going to be the case. So, Mikhail Khodorkovsky was actually the first one to sort of challenge Putin and was then forced into exile. His business was nationalized and turned into Rosneft, which is now run by one of Putin's former KGB cronies, which is Igor Sechin, who's a really interesting guy. They call him like the Darth Vader of Russian politics. He was somebody who ran intelligence agents in Mozambique, speaks fluent Portuguese, things like that movie Lord of War. I think it was speeches about the arms trade. Sechin was very much involved with that type of thing. So that's the kind of what we end up seeing into the 2000s is the demise of the oligarchs who were not willing to play ball, and then their industries given to people that came from the security services, like Silovikis, what they call them. And they call them now like the Silverbucks. So we had Boris Berezovsky was another one who kind of, having brought Putin to power, fell foul of his influence and then was forced into exile in London. And as I said, was found to commit suicide under very suspicious circumstances. So just
you can say what you want about Putin. Not that I support it. Obviously, not supporting anything he's doing, but hats off to that political his power, like what he did there. He's read the 48 Laws of Power. He could have wrote the book.
Yeah, well, he definitely wasn't messing around, right?
No,
but he kind of creates this social contract with crime, and it's kind of a relationship. So one of the best people to write about this is Mark Giolotti. He's sort of Russian expert based in the UK that looks at the crime and intelligence services. So a lot of this slide was from his work, really. But he kind of talks about in his books about a new social contract with the criminal order, where, to an extent, the Russian government wanted to turn a blind eye to organised crime and the Russian mafia, as long as it didn't cause any issues for the state and they didn't charge the state. So basically, I've got that Russian proverb up there: big thieves hang little ones, and that's kind of what you had. Just if as long as you're willing to play my game, then everyone could profit from it, and that's kind of what emerged really in those early 2000s. And then similar to that, you also had on occasions what this radar kind of shows is situations which are fairly well documented, where the Russian government will weaponize criminal organizations, criminal groups, in order to do acts in the national interest. So if you need somebody smuggled out of Cyprus, for example, you could use the FSB or something like that, but why would you, the Russian mafia were specialists at that. That was the bread and butter. So why would you not use that if you have that? It also gives them that plausible deniability. So that's just one example. Assassinations, which take place, all over Europe, Turkey in particular. Things like motorbike gangs, the night wolves, for influence operations in Bosnia and Serbia and places like that. Just the rise of private military contractors and Wagner, kidnapping situations. So all these kind of things, these situations which emerged under Putinism, was effectively where the Russian government choose to weaponize the criminal groups on occasions for their own national interests. Right.
That's a really effective way for them to do things that would be that they can't be associated with, right? Like, because you as a public entity can't be doing those things, but if you have some friends that'll do it for you, and you just all you have to do is look the other way, it's
yeah, and that's it. It's plausible deniability, and the same thing. If we're honestly looking at that as affecting what's happening, do you really think in the cybercrime space, when these ransomware groups are making so much money that they're saying that they're saying things are happening? And I think the truth is, ransomware groups are and will conduct attacks in the national interest if they're asked to. So that's kind of what makes that. So hopefully that gives a little bit of context about the history and the politics and how that kind of all emerges. And so I guess there's a couple of things. So the environment in Russia is actually quite unique, I would argue. There's lots of corrupt countries, right? And there's lots of countries all around the world that, you could probably say, well, that's the same in somewhere else. But one of the things about the Soviet Union was it was competing in this sort of space race with the United States and everyone during the Cold War. And so actually it did educate its people to, a really, sufficient extent when it comes to technology and IT, and it actually developed lots of really bright minds throughout that time period. But the problem was, again, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and then the lack of real private businesses that emerged in the 90s, there wasn't really anywhere for all these really smart, technical people, IT professionals to go to. And hence why you have that skill set, but there's nowhere for them to go. So the natural tendency, obviously, with everything else we've discussed, the symbiosis is to get into cybercrime. So that's probably one of the, I think, the really unique things about Russia, which offers this environment. The other thing is cryptocurrencies, right? So ransomware really explodes, 2008 to 2010, something like that, where I think blockchain emerged shortly after that, and the ability to turn ransomware payments into Bitcoin and in Russia into hard currency really sort of drove the ransomware craze. So I can't remember the exact stats. I think it's 13th in the world, Russia is, in terms of cryptocurrency adoption. So that's like behind like Nigeria and other countries, right? So nothing particularly significant, but one of the major differences is that ability to turn, the black market cryptocurrency into actual hard currency and cash, and be able to cash it out in, even in the center of Moscow with the Federation Towers, where they've actually tracked a lot of the payments coming from. And because in the eyes of the Russian government and the Russian economy, these are professional businesses and they're withdrawing this money. So that's another sort of unique thing about the Russian environment. Obviously, the political situation at the moment, Russia doesn't really subscribe to any treaties, international treaties and things that allow us to extradite anybody. The Budapest memorandum and things like that, which are really important for cybercrime. And I think the other major one to call out is the weakness in Russian law. So there isn't really vigorous laws in Russia to actually say what you're doing is illegal. The kind of laws that people have been prosecuted for cybercrime is kind of more to do with like money laundering, or very fake sort of fraud laws. There isn't a rigorous law in the same way it exists in the UK or wherever else, where it says the Data Protection Act says you can't go and infiltrate someone's computer. That's illegal. That doesn't really exist in Russia. So, and there isn't really any emphasis to go there. So that's another thing which then allows these groups to operate in this grey area, and it really is up to the Russian government whether they choose to prosecute them or not. The one interesting case where the Russian government had clamped down on a ransomware group actually occurred just prior to the Ukrainian invasion in February last year. And if you remember back just prior to the invasion, obviously the United States was warning about the Russians' intentions. There was lots of diplomatic meetings in Geneva. And at that point, ransomware became such a problem that it did make the presidential agenda, and it was raised with President Putin in Geneva about ransomware, and they passed intelligence over about the REVIL group. So Russia did act on that and did arrest what we think now is probably fairly low-level members of that group, which were largely involved in the money laundering side. And I think that was the first real arrest in any of these groups that Russia had conducted. And I think it was more an indicator to say, this is a card that we've got up our sleeves. We can help you and work with you on this, but you're only going to be able to solve this and deal with the ransomware problem if you deal with us. And I think it was a real sort of message, a strategic message to the United States on that point. Interestingly, that some of those operators were actually contracted to the Russian military as well.
And I would guess that those, unless they were they were very unliked by the Russian government, those low level, whoever got arrested, they're not exactly being tortured in prison, I guess.
Well, that's interesting, right? So if you're going to prepare for war, maybe you want to, and I think one of the things I think is apart about REVIL in comparison to some of the other groups is they didn't really have that right creature in place, the top cover in place. They didn't have maybe strong affiliations with people of influence in the security services, and that's maybe another reason why. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, it would be quite a nice thing to have if you had these guys that you've just arrested that could potentially conduct ransomware on behalf of the FSB as a condition of the release or something like that. So that was another sort of scenario I think a lot of cyber teams were kind of playing with when that happened.
But more of a PR campaign then.
I think the main thing was to send an indicator to the United States. That's my take on it. I think the timing worked well.
Absolutely.
Just flicking through. Just walking.
Good old internet lag.
Yeah. So one of the main groups to really look at when we were talking about direct evidence of associations was a group called the we track as Indra Spider. So these guys go by Evil Core, and Maxim Yakovitz was one of the most famous people in ransomware, really, because of his videos, which I've got on screen, which you can check out later on, which is him driving around Moscow in his camouflage Lamborghinis. His license plate has the word "Fori" on it, which is the Russian word for thief. Just doing whatever he wants with his pet tigers and stuff like that. So he was in the media for really extravagant, lavish weddings, costing hundreds of millions. He's known to have direct associations with people in the Kremlin and the Russian government. And interestingly, his spouse, her father is a guy called Bandersky, who actually works as a part of the FSB's kind of one of their elite strike forces called VIMPO. So that's his spouse, that's her father. Bandersky's known to have a direct relationship with Putin, and so you can kind of see that this guy is very well connected. He has that connection to the FSB. And effectively, he was kind of brought up under the kind of father of Russian ransomware, a guy called Bogachev. And they were all known to sort of group to produce what initially it was like the Zeus botnet or the Zeus malware, which was kind of like a banking Trojan that stole passwords and things like that. Eventually sort of morphs into Drydex, which is this much bigger, more famous example. So this group was kind of running those types of cyber crimes. Bogachev kind of mentored Jakubits and a few others. Some of those members of that same group that was operating at Moscow cafes and things like that. They went on to sort of do like egregor ransomware, become Twisted Spiders, how TriStrike tracked that group by. So a lot of the people that was involved in Bogachev's little circle still are in the game and are actually leading them different outfits. But Jakubits was the most famous one because of these videos, because of his connections. But what it does show is that these guys have got direct relationships with the FSB, and this is why they're able to operate with that sort of level of carelessness and do what they do.
Not that it's relevant, but is he actually technical? Do you think he's actually writing code, or is it he knows the right people and he's the leader?
I don't think that detail is there, but I definitely think that all these people, they were probably he was probably operating either the developer side, so either writing some of the code in the malware, or the operations side, so controlling the outfit and how it chose to go up to. I think he was probably pretty technical. He was obviously a lot younger than some of the other ones. That kind of made sense. It's that kind of age group of people that are probably now approaching the 40s that came through at that point. I think this group still is potentially linked to other malware, so I think there is connections with Salt Ghoulish and Raspberry Robin, which are the more later versions. So there's some sort of connections there. So whilst they're not necessarily deploying that much ransomware now, they're still involved in a large part of the cybercrime ecosystem. And interestingly, they were also responsible for, I think it's the most publicly, the highest ransom ever recorded in the public domain was a ransom of $40 million paid by CNA, which is a big insurance firm. That was after this group attacked them a couple of years back. So they still, I think, hold that acknowledged record. Maybe that's changed over the last year or so. We don't really know about it.
What do you think Russian, normal Russians on the streets think of Mr. Aqua here?
I think so. The BBC actually tried to go to Russia and find him, and he was. You can tell that he was protected. The people that were living there had heard of him and knew about him. So it's kind of like in Russian society, it doesn't really operate the way like a normal business would in our sense, but they call it balat, right? It's this cultural concept. It means connections. So if you're well connected, then you're able to, you conduct like a whole spider web of patronage where everyone's going to start owing you something. So I've no doubt that Jakubits is definitely conducting that. He's probably got a circle around him that depend on him and depend on his protection. So I'm sure the people that do know him know exactly what he does and how important he is. Don't get me wrong, I don't think he's a celebrity or anything like that, but under the right circumstances, potentially could be around.
Yeah. Probably gives back to his local community, I would assume, and
Yeah, it was for a price, I think.
Right.
So just skip a few slides forward. The second group where we definitely know that there's connections with the Kremlin and the FSB and places like that is Wizard Spiders. So again, kind of Fin12, Conti is probably the most how they're wider known. And on I can read a quotation up from the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, which says it's highly likely that members of the Conti group have links to Russian intelligence services, and those agencies have likely directed some of the gangs' actions. So what they're saying there is they think it's likely that the Conti has conducted attacks as directed by Russian intelligence services. So kind of reinforcing the point I'm trying to make. But as you kind of mentioned before, this group is probably the biggest, one of the biggest ransomware groups operating in Russia. We know that there was a large presence in St. Petersburg. They probably had maybe 100 people, maybe more, working for them. They kind of organized themselves like a professional business. They had HR teams, recruitment teams, pen testing teams, the kind of whole whack. We know that they made hundreds of millions. There is some reports to say over 2 years they made billions. I don't know if that's exaggerated or not, but it wouldn't surprise me. And probably the lowest level operators don't really make that much money, but good money comparatively for Russia, right? They operate in malware, things like TrickBot, Conti, now more later Bumblebee. But as you mentioned before, when the Ukraine conflict kicked off, there was a split in this group between the Ukrainian operators and the Russian operators, and that led to one of the insiders basically leaking all the files, which was massively damaging for the group. And the Conti leaks, hundreds of thousands of files, and it was an absolute goldmine for intelligence services. And this is where some of the details of this start to emerge, where the senior leaders in this group, they went by the monikers like Professor, Dandis, Tramp, Vishayev, Stern. Sure, these names will be familiar with CTI guys. That some of these operators were meeting people from the FSB face to face. That during COVID, they were being tasked to look for information about vaccines and anything to do with that type of stuff. There is a link with one of the other Russian espionage groups, Cozy Bear. So all this detail starts to emerge out, and now we can, pretty confidently say this group had that relationship. They had that top cover, and they were probably conducting attacks when asked to by the Russian government. Now, this group is then splintered into lots of different groups. So I think we've got Quantum on there. I think that's become, you've got like Black Suit is the latest rebrand of that, of this group, Black Bastard, and Royal. All these sort of different variants that have kind of emerged. Probably some of the guys went to Hive. It kind of splinters into lots of different groups, and there's loads of good analysis out there on Conti Team 1, Conti Team 2, and which operators and which. I probably don't have the details on this slide to go through that bit, but what it means is rather than just looking at one group, now we have to look at like 5 or 6 of these groups.
And the way that analysts have been able to put that together is just by looking at similarities in code and tactics, just doing like the hardcore. This is what that group did. This is what this new group is doing. So we're it's pretty likely that that's.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. It's really tricky. So because some of the variants of the ransomware, you can analyze the code and you can say like this is 80%, the same as this. But often before the ransomware group will collapse, they'll try and sell their payload to another group that might be interested. So sometimes they can buy it off each other. So it's not necessarily, you can't have so much confidence in the assessment. That's what makes it tricky. The other thing, obviously, is we're trying to, the real interesting thing with the ransomware groups is the choke point is on the developers, the guys who are actually making the encryptors. There's not really that many of them, and they tend to steal each other's developers. And so that's where, if you want to really impact Russian ransomware, you need to go after those guys because they're kind of the crown jewels in the whole system. But yeah, they'll either steal a developer, they can buy their own, buy their sample and continue on in a different name, different brand, or sometimes they could just re-emerge with a new name, a new brand, and affiliates will then kind of chop and change depending on who's got the best model. So sometimes the TCPs will overlap, and that's where you can really start to say, okay, this group's probably the same as that group. But it's tricky. It's not easy to do.
Well, it's not like we have a video camera of this happening.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, though.
Yeah. So we move on. So Rebel was one of the groups. I think CrowdStrike tracks this as Pinchy Spider. The interesting thing as well, a lot of these, some people like John DiMaggio and stuff like that, they start to interview some of the ransomware operators, which I think is brilliant, because you get lots of really good, interesting things that they're talking about. And in one of these interviews, I can't remember who it was, did it, maybe it was Dimitri from Recorded Future, I'm not sure, but the interview of Non, who was the leader of Rebel, way back. And he said that as a weapon, ransomware can be very destructive. It's quite feasible to start a war, but it's not worth it because the consequences are not profitable. And I think that's largely what we see with these ransomware groups, is they are purely interested in profit. Conte made that mistake of picking a side, and that's when the Ukrainians kicked off about it. And that led to the demise of the group ultimately. I think the majority of ransomware groups are just purely focused on profit and are financially motivated. But what he's saying there is, ransomware is destructive, and under the right circumstances, you can take out networks and destroy targets, basically. So using it as a weapon is a very feasible scenario. The last group is an interesting group. So this is Tropical Scorpius. So I don't think CrowdStrike have got a spider name for these guys, but initially these guys were Cuba ransomware, and still are. There is sort of associations with a lot of the malware, things like Rom, and basically an assessment made by multiple cybersecurity teams. I think Unit 42, maybe some others, where basically their overall victimology is very typically ransomware. But since the Ukraine conflict, they have noticed attacks against probably more political targets. So the one that went largely unnoticed was last year, an attack by Cuba against the government of Montenegro, which was very damaging, actually. There was significant impact all across Montenegro for at least a week when I think there was reporting that the FBI actually deployed a specialist team to help the Montenegro government recover. So this was obviously off the back of Montenegro becoming a NATO member. Montenegro is an area in Europe where Russian organised crime, but also the Russian government has quite a lot of influence. They did try sort of coup d'etats against the government in the past, and it was an area where they were desperate to probably keep from NATO's grip. Huge amounts of Russian to Montenegro, lots of property investments and things like that. So it was quite an interesting attack, and then they also have picked up quite a lot of this group attacking Ukraine, which you wouldn't really do as a ransomware group because there's not a bit of money to be made, really. So
yeah, exactly.
Really interesting group to look at and one to watch for the future. So I would recommend keeping an eye on Cuba. And then finally, just to finish off, so one of the things we used to do in the military was use have different spectrums of war, right? So again, if your listeners maybe not able to visualize this, but if you can imagine sort of 5 lines, horizontal lines on top of each other, and say that top line is conventional war. So number 1 on that horizontal axis might be something like, posture and pre-positioning military troops on the border or something like that. Maybe some exercises. That would kind of be 1, 2 on that spectrum. And then 10 would obviously be nuclear war. So an outbreak of conflict might be sort of 3 or 4. Full mobilization, Article 5 from NATO, 5 or 6, and then you kind of go up, and then it's obviously not a place you ever want to go to. Underneath that, you've got asymmetric warfare, so this could be anything from sort of covert assassinations, proxy conflicts, which we're seeing now, all over the world, potentially state-sponsored terrorism, sabotage, things like blowing up Nord Stream 2, and the Nord Stream pipelines might be an example of where we are on the asymmetric warfare spectrum. Economic warfare, you've got kind of, we're working on that. It can go from tariffs all the way up to sort of naval blockades, embargoes, just, the kind goes without saying, really. And then information warfare, where I would argue again, we're kind of really up on that spectrum in terms of where we're sitting with Russian disinformation, bots, influencing elections, all that type of stuff. So I guess and then you've got cyber. Cyber is, or electronic warfare and cyber is probably a different spectrum. So if you imagine all these different spectrums that kind of work out from 1 to 10 where we're sitting with NATO and Russia or the Western Northern Russia, I'd say, in information warfare, we're kind of right up there. I don't think there's that much more room to maneuver. I think we're kind of already almost doing everything, and the Russians are doing everything to us. Economic warfare, I'd argue we probably sort of 7, 8 out of 10. There is obviously levers we can still pull to economically destroy Russia, but we're kind of up there. Like, there's not really that much we can go with. Asymmetric warfare is definitely going to be, on the 9-10 spectrum. The blowing up of sabotage of CNI and things like that is happening. And so really that only leaves two spectrums to escalate in if you want to, or if Russia wants to. And that is cyber and conventional warfare. Now, in conventional warfare, we're probably right on the low end. We're not at war with Russia. There has been sort of incidents potentially involving aircraft over the Black Sea and things like that. So it's one to watch. That might go maybe 2 or 3. But I would argue that the main space to escalate in is the cyber realm, because you can do that potentially without risking World War III. So I guess that is something for cyber teams and cybersecurity to consider, is that if there is further escalations and if we continue on this trajectory that we've got on, cyber will be that space where we're going to go to. And ransomware makes a very good weapon, and you can have that possible deniability to attack the UK financial sector or wherever without potentially triggering World War III. So I guess that's just thoughts from my own assessments and some of the things that I kind of worry about for scenarios going forward. So that's kind of the content. The brief is obviously so much there, so hopefully that gives a bit of insight into Russian ransomware.
I've said it already. It was my favorite presentation. It's really fascinating how this all hangs together, and how it's me, I started working with security in 2014. I had no idea that this was like a thing, and a lot of people that are working with cybersecurity day to day, hacking away, doing their thing. It's really enlightening to hear about why things are the way they are. And I remember one of the people in the at the FS-ISAC event, they asked you, so what if Putin was to not be the president anymore? Like, what sort of effect would that have? You want to repeat your answer?
Yeah, so I think I answered like no effect at all, or something to that extent. And the reason for that is, regardless of what happens with President Putin, the only people that are going to come to power, in my view, after this is people that are part of his inner circle or a part of this system. So there are people that are bought into this regime. Ultimately, this ideology does have widescreen support in Russia. The people who are in opposition have been systematically crushed. Either Boris Nemtsov, Alexei Navalny. There's not very many prominent figures left. So the idea that we can have someone post-Putin come to power and be really open and friendly and transparent with the West, I don't think will happen, or I think it's unlikely. And then you also have to consider that, there's lots of money to be made in this game. These ransomware groups are making money, and they're then paying off FSB, law enforcement, police. They then have that money. Politicians obviously will be involved. They've got all sorts of immunity and things like that to save them from these things. So it's all part of a clan system, and in which there's different factions in the Kremlin, and you have to be a criminologist to really understand what's going on, and probably even they don't understand it. But there's factions in there, and so when Putin eventually does go, I can imagine there being infighting and political instability until one faction emerges as the strongest, unless he decides to pick a successor and pass over that as in a transition of power. But either way, I don't think there will be anyone that I can think of that has a political chance of succeeding that will suddenly turn all this around for us. So I think that's probably a bleak but real assessment.
Well, based on what you've taught us today, they'll have the entire system against them if that was to happen. So,
yeah,
Mr. Flockhart, thank you so much for sharing your analysis. Super interesting to listen to, and thank you to Santander for paying you to go out do all this. It's awesome. I've had a great time, and I think the listeners do too. So, thank you for now, and don't be surprised if I give you a call, because now I have a bunch of more questions for you, but it's like, okay, how do you apply all your knowledge that you've just shared with us to defending Santander, right?
Right.
Because there's, you have all this knowledge, and I'm assuming it's useful for in a threat intelligence perspective. So, but I will give you a break until that time.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Have a great day and a good weekend.
Yeah, you too. Have a good one.